Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we dissect and analyze some of the cool, epic, awesome, cozy, interesting, amazing power of storytelling and how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Goev.
And I'm Kevin.
You know, Kev, one of the things that excites us about storytelling, one of the main reasons this show exists, is once we started exploring storytelling, once we started talking about storytelling, we saw it everywhere. And you know, Kev, we've been having a lot of conversations this season about grocery stores, but how people can get pretty passionate about their grocery store. And a lot of these grocery stores sell the same thing, but based on the type of store it is, it's branded differently. One of the famous examples is Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's is a grocery store in California, and it has a cult following. I shop at Trader Joe's. It's very close to me. We've been shopping there since college. It's very close to us. We like it. It has good availability, but a lot of it's branding, right? A lot of it's this idea that you feel that the people there are curating this thing where anything you buy there is going to be great because it's highly curated. But you know, if you do research into Trader Joe's, there's a lot of items there that are literally the same product from the same factory that you find in other grocery stores. It's just they added the Trader Joe's branding, which allows them to mark it up slightly and makes you feel better about it. There's sometimes I have this feeling in Trader Joe's where it's like, everything at Trader Joe's is good for me. I've decided. And that's just not true, right? There's times where I buy something, oh, it's from Trader Joe's, so it's fine, right? That's an insane brand.
Yeah, and also some people just find the brand endearing to them. I've seen this tweet a few years back, sort of a meme, but it basically talks about whoever tweeted this, when they shopped at Trader Joe's, they felt like, you know, it was actually someone named Joe that handpicked all of the product and put everything on the shelves. It gives off sort of a mom and pop shop feel almost, even though it's a brand. So yeah, the brand and the story that this place has managed to build is definitely pretty impressive.
It's one of the biggest grocery chains in California, but it doesn't have a corporate face like Target or Walmart does, even though, again, you can get the same products for cheaper sometimes in both. That's interesting. I think that some people feel conned in some way. I don't think that's conning. I think that's storytelling. I think if you can make someone feel better about their purchase, why not do it, right? I mean, if you feel like Trader Joe's is conning you, stop shopping at Trader Joe's, right? You have that agency. But if Trader Joe's is going to make you feel better about your purchase and feel excited about going to your grocery store, especially in this age with like Instacart, Uber Eats, things like that, great. Honestly, it's great.
Yeah, you know, we've talked about this on the show as well. The stuff we own, our purchasing actions, these are all, you know, actions that add to our own stories. You always have the agency to decide what goes into your story.
I mean, I see the same thing with another grocery store called Erewhon. I've shopped there a few times. I get it. There's a feeling about being in an Erewhon store where everything feels luxury. Like, honestly, you feel like you've made it when you shop at an Erewhon store. Now, when I shop at Erewhon stores, I buy not a lot of stuff. It's not my go-to grocery store, but it's cool to buy like one or two hip, cool, healthy type thing. There's always people in like, Erewhon sells workout gear. Like, they sell clothing. Like, you can, and I see a lot of people wearing Erewhon sweatpants, a tote bag. It's amazing that this grocery store created such a brand that people are wearing t-shirts of it. Imagine wearing a Walmart t-shirt, Kev.
Yeah, it's definitely a lifestyle that they are selling. Quite recently, Erewhon opened a new store in Pasadena, and they turned it into a whole opening event and had a whole bunch of influencers attend. Apparently, it was so crowded, and all those influencers were posting so much that within that tiny little store, you couldn't get a cellular signal at one point because of how just the amount of hype and clout, if you will, that this grocery shop is getting. And speaking of branding and storytelling, differentiating products, if you've ever taken online courses, you've probably heard about MasterClass.
I am a huge online course person. Like, go to my LinkedIn and go to certifications. I love me a good online course. I've been a MasterClass subscriber for years. I'm excited for this one. Kev, who are we talking about?
Today, we are chatting with Davis Carter. He has most recently been the director of content at MasterClass. He has led the charge on masterclasses with some of the most famous or most skilled people in the world in their respective field of expertise. You got Neil Gaiman teaching you about storytelling, Coach K, legendary basketball coach, teaching you about leadership. And today we're going to chat with Davis and pull behind the curtain of this creation process, see how he implements storytelling in creating online courses and how MasterClass differentiates itself. I'm excited to get into this conversation. Let's get started. Could you pronounce your full name for us, please?
Yes, Davis Carter.
All right. To start us off, Davis, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
I, until about 3 weeks ago, was a director of content at MasterClass, and I was there for about 6.5 years. I've recently moved on to lead content initiatives for another company. I think my relationship with storytelling, it's something that I kind of fell into as far as a career is concerned. It starts a little bit with my mom, I like to say. She's a very hip lady, very insightful and self-aware, and she had these things when I was growing up that she called golden moments, which are just things that really kind of shape you as a person. And they can be an experience in nature, they could be a conversation. And she was always, telling me that I should be on the lookout for those and track what they were. And I had found pretty quickly that as a kid, a lot of my golden moments related to stories. Those were the things that really made me feel and impacted me and shaped my understanding of the world. And so that's kind of where it all started, to be honest. And then as it relates to coming into storytelling as a career, I fell into that a little bit in an interesting way, I think, which is that I was in Catholic school for a really long time. My parents loved it. It was a Catholic school. They're both very Catholic. And I hated it. Didn't hate religion, but I hated the rigid structure of Catholic school. I was there all the way until 10th grade and finally was just like, something needs to change. And I went to my parents and I was like, I can't really do this anymore. I want to go to public school. They said, you can't go to public school unless you find a program that you can get into that's meaningful. Like you can't just hop over to public school. There's got to be a value add as we see it. And I didn't have the grades to get into like a baccalaureate program or anything like that. I was kind of a middling student, but there was one public high school that had an art quest program is what it was called. And it was basically, you could go, you had to get in, but you would dedicate 2 periods a day to an art form. So it was everything from drama to photography to musical instruments, all that kind of stuff. And not being an inherently creative person, I thought at the time, I didn't have a portfolio. So I applied to the only one that didn't require a portfolio, which was video, because at the time, not everybody had a video camera on their phone. And I got in based on an essay and a letter of recommendation. So kind of as a means to an end, fell into some video work and then immediately fell in love with that. And then since then have made that kind of my main focus.
Tell us a little bit about kind of getting into this industry. What was your first role? How did that lead to MasterClass? How did that lead to the role you're in now? Tell us a little bit about kind of breaking into this industry.
Sure. So I watched a lot of Entourage in college. I'm not sure if you watched it or if anybody who's listening has watched
I
it.
just finished Entourage.
My wife and I just rewatched it.
Yeah, it's an interesting show because I don't know it gets 9 seasons in today's climate because not today's climate, 100% not today's climate, but I mean in today's entertainment structure because every single season's the same.
Oh yeah,
like it's the same storyline over and over again. And I don't know if that works in the current entertainment industry.
Yeah, especially something that like ostensibly positions itself as serialized, but it's essentially, it's not. It's the same thing every time. It's like he's not going to do the movie. Oh, he is going to do the movie. Yay! And definitely couldn't be made today. My wife and I were wincing a lot. We're like, ooh, we didn't remember how really off color this is and not appropriate. But so I in college watched a lot of Entourage and fully had it in my mind that I wanted to be Ari Gold when I graduated. And so I started out, really gung ho on that and ended up in the mailroom at ICM and was put onto an agent's desk and it was kind of a swimming with sharks situation. He was just toxic. He literally gave the person before me peptic ulcers because he stressed him out so bad. and found out very quickly. I was like, oh, I don't want to be an agent. Not only is this uncomfortable, but I just don't have the personality for it. And so I was trying to find what else I might want to be doing, and was then at a distribution company, independent film distribution company, for a little while. And I was an acquisitions executive for them for a little while, but I found that I really wanted to be more on like the making as opposed to the buying something that was already done. And so then I was an assistant to the president of the MGM TV studio for a number of years, and then a creative executive at a smaller production company. But I got a little bit burnt out on traditional film and television. Development hell is a very real thing, and I was in it for a long time, and it can beat you down. And so I was looking for what else I might be able to do in the content creation space, that might not be working for a studio or making movies or TV shows. And I kind of, with that focus, was able to find MasterClass. And I think at the time MasterClass had like 35 employees and maybe 4 classes out. And I had a friend of a friend who was able to put me in touch, and I got that job and was there for 6.5 years.
That's really interesting. That kind of pivot out, because I think when I talk to a lot of people in the industry, uh, this you don't see a lot of that. You see people once they're in, they're in. It's really hard to pivot into even something ostensibly different, especially as like a creative and a storyteller in your own right. I'm curious about environments, because I think the conversation of how your environment shapes your career and how it shapes industries has been talked about a lot more recently, with the pandemic and work from home. Because I think with with environments, tech is in San Francisco, entertainment's in Hollywood, banking's in New York. What was it like kind of being in this kind of creative entertainment space in San Francisco versus Hollywood? Was there a draw for the company to go to Hollywood? What was that like as a creative?
That's a really good question. Masterclass started in San Francisco, definitely, because it was very much like a tech adjacent, I guess, because we also, we kind of sometimes would say that it started as a tech company that but didn't know it was a content company, because it really is. Same thing with like Netflix. It's like tech, yeah, kind of, but they're offering their product is content. Um, and so I think that's why it started there. And as the company grew, we did have a pretty sizable office in LA, and still I think there's a fair amount of people who work there that are based there. Um, but it was an interesting kind of cultural shift that I found coming from entertainment or traditional entertainment to San Francisco. One is that I was around people that are a lot closer to my age. In the studio system, you might be with a pool of assistants who are your same age, and then everybody else is, or the vast majority of the people above you are 10, 15 years older than you, if not, 20 or 30. And so that was one thing that was interesting. And that there was also kind of a different approach to risk taking that I appreciated. Like, if you're in a meeting with some studio executives or giving notes on something, I kind of felt like if you shouldn't raise your hand in traditional film and television unless your idea was bulletproof. It was like, don't make a bomb. And I understand it's a business. You don't want to make bombs, but it was a lot of like kind of fear-based decision making. And I found a really big shift when I came up to San Francisco and was working at MasterClass, and it was genuinely open and collaborative. They're like, we're doing something new. Who has ideas? And they meant it, and so it was a big change, and it was something that I really appreciated.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had a similar experience because I worked at a tech company in Los Angeles instead of an entertainment company in San Francisco. And it was such an interesting experience because it is run differently because of where it is, right? It's a different vibe, and you don't really get that unless you understand the industry, unless you work in an industry where you work with a lot of people. And it's just the company has a different culture
Hmm.
based on where it's based, because I think that's one thing that people are trying to forget almost with the pandemic, but that still happens where it disseminates from the headquarters, right? That's where culture disseminates from. So where your headquarters is actually does still have a profound impact on how your company is run.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing too. I think, I mean, the economic climate, I've come to realize, also plays a pretty big role, because I think, when I was in 2016 when I started at MasterClass, VC money was flowing, growth was the most important thing. There was money on the table to play around and take risks with. And I think, I can't say it definitively, but I've kind of felt a shift, particularly in the last couple of years, where money's tight, growth is now not the only objective. Survival is. that a lot of that more kind of traditional film and television thinking and risk aversion has become very prominent, even in places like San Francisco. So
Mhm.
it's I think it's geographical, cultural, and also there's real economic elements that play into that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've, really hopped around, tested all the waters within the industry and landed the career you really wanted in content creation. So tell us more about that. How does a master class get made from your perspective, and what is your role in it as director of content?
Yeah, well, so I'll start with like what my role is, and then I'll get to like kind of how it gets made. As a director of content, we're essentially in charge of overseeing the creative and logistical elements of a project from start to finish. So, for example, I'll use like Neil Gaiman because he's, in my opinion, one of the best living storytellers we've got. This is a podcast on storytelling. So, from the moment people are saying, Neil Gaiman wants to do a masterclass, the creative director and the producer they're working with are in charge of shaping it all the way from development through post. And so in development, that is coming up with like what we would call a curriculum. So just like a structure that the class will ultimately take, broken up by what we call chapters. The interview questions themselves, like how we kind of fill out those different topics and the different things we're going to try and explore. Collaboration with the instructors and their teams to make sure that we're aligned going into the shoot. And then also the ideation of the set design, making sure that aligns with the instructor and their vibe. Collaboration with our partners in production to kind of get the shoot up on its feet, and then during the shoot, directing and interviewing the what we're capturing, and then in post, working with our motion graphics designers and our editors to shape the raw material that we capture into what's ultimately going up on the site. And then within that, there's also a bunch of cross-functional collaboration with our partners in marketing and insights to make sure that we're positioning the launch correctly. It really there's a ridiculous amount of people involved that are all very talented, and so a lot goes into making it. And I think to like answer the first part of your question, which is like how does a master class get made? For me, I think people approach it slightly differently, but for me, the genesis or the starting point is there's two questions that I'm asking myself, which is who is this person? Like at their core, what is their vibe? That's kind of a weird way to say it, but like what's their personal brand, visually, aesthetically, whatever that might be. And then also like what is their unique mastery? What's the thing that they can do or that they're the best at that nobody else can do like them? And everything else, like every creative decision, I think kind of stems from answering those two questions all the way through when it gets up on the website.
With regards to the point of figuring out the instructor's unique mastery, um, I wonder what that's like. I'm sure sometimes people come to you knowing what they want to teach. Other times you kind of have to bring it out of them. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that discovery process is like?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a spectrum for instructor involvement when it comes to our collaboration. Some people are just like, point me at what you want me to do, and I'll do it. Some people want to be really involved and are getting granular with like, to the wording of what a question might be that we're going to ask them. And some people, it kind of rests in the middle. And there's also kind of an interesting Venn diagram of what we are most interested in hearing about from them, what we understand our users or the public might be most interested in, and what they're willing to or excited about talking about. And we kind of how that Venn diagram overlaps varies from person to person. As it relates to collaboration with the instructors, we make sure that we're aligned. Some are more flexible, some are more game to do different things. And I think for me, it all kind of starts with research, a tremendous amount of research. I think I kind of have to get what I call like fluent in that person in their craft. For things that I'm unfamiliar with, I've done classes with people about like crypto, poker, negotiation, writing, filmmaking, leadership, like the whole spectrum. And so for the ones that I'm completely unfamiliar with, it starts sometimes with just like reading a for dummies book. So I'm like, how do I even know what the pieces of this thing are? So I can then kind of begin to wrap my head around this person and how they fit into that ecosystem. And there's a ton more that goes into kind of like drafting a curriculum and research, but really it starts with this kind of casting a wide net, and then constellations kind of start to form about both that subject matter and then also that person.
A huge part of our show is that we talk to unique, unconventional storytellers from all walks of life. And their careers and day to day might be as different as night and day, but somehow they can all tell us something about storytelling, and you're able to draw common lessons from such a wide range of people. I wonder, if you've had that experience working on MasterClass as well, because you got people from Neil Gaiman to Steph Curry. Is there a common kind of storytelling lesson from all these different masters?
I would say it might not be 100, like I have 100% hit rate, but I do think that there's certain common denominators for me that have kind of popped up. And I think one is that a lot of them recognize the importance of stories, whether that's somebody like Neil Gaiman, who, that one of his main theses is the importance of stories, both in his writing and also in just like the work that he does with libraries and literacy and all that stuff. So that's a very literal take of that. But then also we have people, like John Kabat-Zinn, and the importance of stories is a theme for him as well, in the shape of stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And then you also, you have people like Kim Scott and President Bill Clinton, who talk about, if you want something to land with somebody in a presentation or in a speech, whatever it might be, put a story in it. And so I think one would be that, hey, like, stories are important. I would say that's a common denominator from a lot of these masters. And another one I think is that having lived experience is a really valuable tool for effective storytelling. Like if you want to be good at it, it's good to go out and experience things. And you don't have to, if you're going to tell a story, you don't have to have experienced that exact thing, but experience creates empathy, I think. And empathy, it's a really important part of telling a compelling story. And there's also just one other thing I'll say is that, you know, I've worked with a lot of masters at MasterClass, both as instructors, but also the people that I've worked with. And there's a really interesting lesson I learned from one of my managers about storytelling that was pretty significant for me. And it was essentially, she said, like, good stories are not the night sky, they're the constellations. And so, good stories are as much about what you leave out as what you put in. I would consider her to be a master, and that's a thesis from her on storytelling as well.
I love the idea of simplicity, right? It's really easy to sit down with someone and get into the details and want to ask them every single thing, but that's when you're 2 hours in and you've only talked about one thing. Can you tell us a little bit about fighting that urge when working with any kind of master where you're like, one day of this person's life could be a 6 hour interview? How do you zoom out when you could be just poking on that one deal or that one moment or that one speech?
That is the hardest thing. I can't say definitively it's the hardest, but it's one of the hardest things that we encounter, because, on the one hand, you're sitting with these people and you have an opportunity to ask them literally anything you want, and so, I mean, that's you have carte blanche in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of decision making that goes into figuring out what to ask them about. And part of it comes back to that element I was talking about, of like the Venn diagram aligning between like what they're willing to talk about, what people want to know, and what their unique mastery is. So really, I mean, that, like, I think, for example, like if we're just going to talk about Judd Apatow, he's a true multi-hyphenate, stand-up comedian, writer, director, producer. Conceivably could teach a full class on any of those one things. And, like a lot of our instructors, full textbooks are written about the subjects that they're talking about. And we obviously can't do an entire, textbook full of content with each of these people. So it's really comes down to kind of prioritization, which is just a creative judgment call that we have to make. And that's, the story of the course that we have to pitch to our executives, that we have to pitch to that person. And for me, again, it comes down to like, what's their unique mastery? It's like, yes, they could talk about that and that would be interesting, but what is at their core the thing that they're better at than anybody else? And like, let's kind of use that to guide us. So for me, that's kind of how I approach it. And I mean, and also like even in the editing bay, it's, you want to preserve every word. And sometimes there's this beautiful thing that somebody said, but unfortunately it needs to take you 5 minutes to get there, just because otherwise it won't make sense. And it sucks, but sometimes you have to kill your darlings, because the one thing I've found myself saying to our editors and our producers a lot is that, if somebody gets bored and turns it off after the second chapter because we had that 5 minute detour just to get to that beautiful moment, the rest of this content that they won't come back to is lost to them. So we really need to make sure that we're prioritizing the potency and the like kind of like the snappiness and hook to make sure that we're keeping people.
Do you have an example or thought about a question you've asked where you like was so awestruck, you're like, that has to end up in it. That has to be an anchor point.
Yeah, let me think about that. Definitely, because there's ones, because you fight for those too. Like I don't like to surrender anything until I've made absolutely sure that I've gotten it as tight as it possibly can be. And if it still isn't quite working, then that's when I make that decision. But we wrestle with stuff in the edit a lot, and sometimes like probably too much. Like I've spent like 3 hours working on one like chapter to try and make it flow in one pass. And that's like one chapter out of 20. So I'm always fighting for them. The one that's coming to mind for me is during the interview with President Clinton, there was a question I was really excited to ask him about, which is when you're president or you're the top of any leadership organization, the buck kind of stops with you, and how do you handle those situations where the result of your decision is going to have an adverse effect on somebody. You can't always please everybody, whether it's layoffs or whatever it might be, and like who better to kind of answer that question than the person who's been in charge of, arguably, the most powerful country in the world. And I was really excited to ask him about it. And he had a really, really intense response that had to do with a decision he had made during, I think it was like the conflict in Bosnia, to bomb a bridge. And after he had made that decision, a bus full of refugees went across the bridge. And so like the button had already been pushed, the missile was in the air, this bus was on the bridge, and a lot of people died, unfortunately. And he was just like, as a leader, you have to live with that. And that's something that you have to, across that you kind of have to bear yourself. And that's relevant in all different kinds of leadership positions. He had these, we called them war eyes, in the edit bay. And so, I mean, that was one where in the moment, I was just like, there's no way that we can't include that piece of content. And stuff like that happens all the time. It's not always going to be that emotionally significant, but sometimes it's just a beautiful insight or experience that somebody had.
When you're sitting across from a president or an icon like that and you're in charge of the story, you're in charge of the storytelling, you are there to make sure it flows, you are there to control it in a sense. Like, how do you know when to push, when to pull back? How do you build that trust and control the story? Because that's in some way your job when you're sitting across from a president.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. I think it starts with just treating them as people. Like it sounds simple and it sounds kind of like cliche, but it's a very true thing where you're like, this person is a president. I am going to call them Mr. President because that's the way they like to be referred to. But they're still a person, and so just like trying to, as much as you can, just forget like who they are, how significant they are, and just pretend that I'm just a person sitting across the table from them, having dinner and having the opportunity to ask them interesting questions. So it starts there, because if you come into it really keyed up or like, oh, like walking on eggshells, people just kind of feel it and they're like, oh man, this is another one of those things. So it starts there. It starts with having a few conversations with them in advance. So the first time that they're seeing your face isn't when they're sitting in a chair across from you with a camera between the two of you. And then, it's a dance. There are times where, I definitely, a lot of really, really strong content does come from pushing, where somebody offers a response and you're like, there's more there. I'm going to push. And, your answer like, well, it can't be that simple or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's like strategically asking a question that that they're going to want to correct you on, so you're kind of like, oh, so it's just like this. And you can kind of get them to be like, no, it's not like that. What I'm saying is, and then I'm just like, got them, and sometimes it's just, there's like an intuition that you have that, there's something deeper. An example that comes to mind is when we were doing the class with Chris Voss, who's a hostage negotiator. One of the questions that I was still trying to answer for myself was like, why did he do this? Why did he pick this job? Is he like an adrenaline junkie? Because he negotiated with like terrorists, bank robbers. Like, what brought him there? And he had said something at some point where he was talking about how he doesn't like bullies. He had mentioned it earlier in the interview. And then on day 3, we were doing kind of some of our wrap up conversation, for like our conclusion. And we got back into it. And I was just like, yeah. And I asked him again. I was just like, but why though? He was like, I don't like bullies. And I was like, yeah, but why? And he was like, I just don't like him. And I was just like, there's more that I got to get to. And he ended up sharing the story about how when he was young, um, he was out with in the neighborhood before dinner, just playing as kids do, and like a bully like came up to him and like was gonna beat him up and pinned him to the ground, and was talking to him about like how he was going to be arrested or something, just like those weird things that little kids make up to mess with other ones. And he could hear his mom literally ringing the dinner bell. And he was pinned down by this bully, and he just like started crying. And that was like a golden moment for him in a bad way. But he was just like, and that's why I don't like bullies. And it was interesting because it really cracked open the whole thing for him. And I was like, I get it. His whole kind of career and everything he's done can be traced back to that one moment. So it's just knowing it's kind of, it's a dance. You just feel it, I think.
So this is interesting. So a big part of your interviewing style, a big part of your style as a storyteller is you're looking for those golden moments and finding ways to connect them with everyone, no matter if they're a president, a negotiator, an expert storyteller.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it starts again with like, who is this person and why are they the way they are and what do they do better than anybody else? And so I do my best to understand as much of that story as I possibly can. Find the things that I'm like, oh, this is that thing they do. They like maybe it's I was reading somebody's book and I'm like, oh, they're doing that thing again. I'm going to ask them about that. And then sometimes it's just in the course of the interview being like, here's this big open question that I want to try and answer for myself, and I think hopefully other people will be interested in knowing the answer to. So it's just built on that research and that foundation of knowing what you do know, what you want to know, and like what's still kind of TBD, if that makes sense.
How is it? This is such an interesting job you've had and career you've had where you've interviewed all these like amazing, amazing people. How is it? I know this is going to be way too big of a question, but how has it changed you? How has it made you a better storyteller going through these intensive connection points of all these amazing people?
That is a good question. Um, I think that one of the things, there's probably two things that I would say. One is that you'd be surprised by the things that shape people. Um, it's really interesting in the interviews where you kind of cut to the core of somebody and you're like, there it is. I don't even know if they knew that that was so significant for them. I don't know if they had thought about that in that way. Because that's one of the things about masterclasses. We're asking people to think about things in a way that they normally don't. And then I think another thing that I've really taken away from it is there's something kind of like there's something powerful in finding universal truths within specific things, which is a weird place to take that to. But the example that I have is Chris Hadfield is an astronaut. We have a class on space exploration and astronauting. And not everybody, there's very few people on the planet that are going to be astronauts. Yet we had a class on it because people might just be interested in it. And one of the pieces of content that I think is a standout in not just his class, but our library as a whole. And we know this because we've looked into like the qualitative and quantitative research, is the story he has about contingency plans in space. Contingency plans are obviously very important because if you don't have them, people are going to die. And he went on to say, like, but contingency plans are really important, not just in space, but in life. Like you should have a plan for if a fire happens in your house, whatever it might be. And there's something really compelling and poignant about finding a universal truth within a specific realm. And that's just something that I saw happen a lot in my work at MasterClass, and it's something that I've been going to take with me for sure.
Amazing answer, by the way. No, I love that. It's a huge part of the show too. Our show. I mean, of course, on a much smaller scale, but we love that. Like I was saying earlier, we love when we do a episode with someone and we get super specific and we get to talk about storytelling. We talk about their version of storytelling, and ostensibly, you don't always see how that connects to the other guests until you listen to a few more and watch us zoom out and say, this is just all storytelling. And that's the point. And when people are like, oh, you're talking about the same thing, we're like, we 100% are. But if you really think about it, it's the same thing, just in a different context. And we love to empower people and be like, we are all storytellers. Humanity is storytellers, right? That's what it is. And that's why we love this idea. I love that idea of like the universal and specific, because it's a huge part of why we do this.
Davis, we've learned so many great stories and insights from you today. And to be mindful of your precious time, we have this closing segment called Suspenders. This is where we ask you a fun, random question unrelated to anything, and you can give us any answer you feel like. And question of the day is, if you could create a new holiday, what would it be and how would it be celebrated?
Yeah, just shooting right from the hip because something popped directly into my head. And it might already exist. I don't know, but it would be Hawaiian Shirt Day, where everybody wears Hawaiian shirts and you have a tiki party. Just because I think those are super awesome, and I love cocktails with rum in them and being outside in the sun. So it'd be like dead smack in the middle of summer, Hawaiian Shirt Day, luau.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was really great. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for setting it up. I had a really nice time talking with you.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the cool and interesting learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week we had Davis Carter. It was so interesting to talk to him, Kev, because one, I'm a huge online learning person. I love online learning. I love learning. And he's someone who's interviewed some of the smartest, most impactful people of all time. And it was great talking to him because we saw him kind of editing in his head, kind of being the element of being someone being interviewed instead of interviewer. So we saw him actually trying to help us in that way of trying to phrase his interview questions in ways that would work for an interview, right? Yeah. We saw him doing that editing in his head because he's so used to being the guy on the other side of the mic.
Yeah, it was definitely great to pull behind the curtain and see how storytelling is utilized in creating classes and, a very diverse range of classes as well. Definitely a lot of great learnings from this conversation.
Yeah, and I think one of the first things is this idea of environment. I was reading Guy Raz's How I Built This Book, and he talks a lot about the environment you work in, right? How working in tech in San Francisco, working in entertainment in Los Angeles, how much that can impact your career journey, especially with entrepreneurship. Going somewhere where people are excited about it, going somewhere where you go in a coffee shop and other people are working on something similar, being in that energy and how important that is to starting a company or running a company. So I think the conversation we had with him about working in entertainment in Los Angeles and moving and working in kind of more of a tech hybrid in San Francisco and how that affected his career and affected how MasterClass's content built and grew and that company grew is really important. So I think it's really important to sit down and think about the stories your environment is telling, what the people around you are working on, how that's affecting you, how that affects how you see success. So I encourage people to think about the city they live in, the town they live in, what success looks like in that town, and how that's affect how you see the world.
And another important point is Davis shared with us one of his biggest storytelling lessons throughout the process of creating these classes is what you leave out of a class or a project or a story is as important as what you keep in. You really need to think about including the right amount of information and when and how to shed everything else. And how you achieve that is you should have a good idea of what is the central message you're trying to tell with this story. And in Davis's case, when he begins building out a class, he and his team spend a lot of time researching on the instructor, what is their personal brand like? What is their unique mastery? So that they can create a class designed around this person that makes sense to the public and the students about the instructor's image, right? So, because let's be honest, these are, very famous, successful, cool personalities. And of course, if you have the amount of time Davis has with them, you want to ask them everything. You want to learn everything from them. But it's not as constructive when the goal is to build a complete and effective story that is made digestible for your audience. So obviously you need to know what to include in your story, but also learn to pick and choose what you keep out.
And this is one of my biggest struggles with storytelling, especially in like work environments. I want to say everything. I want everyone to know everything. But sometimes that's very overwhelming, especially people at higher levels. And something I'm working on is trying to know what not to leave in, right? I mean, what not to say, because they don't need to know that. They don't need to get in the muck. That's my responsibility, right? So be very crucial what you leave in and what you don't talk about. And I think one other thing, I remember very vividly, starting Gordon Ramsay's MasterClass, and he does this thing where he tours you around his kitchen, and the passion in his voice, man. This is one of the reasons I think Gordon Ramsay is one of the best storytellers of all time, is that people know he's one of the world's greatest chefs. He's a great brand. But watching him go through his kitchen in this MasterClass, it made me want to find things that I'm passionate about like that. Things that get me excited, And I think this brings to the point I'm trying to make here, is that one of our biggest parts of the show is that exposing you to different types of storytelling that probably has nothing to do with your field. An example, a wine expert. A lot of our listeners probably aren't wine experts or in the wine field, but it's the idea that you can learn anything from anyone. Even if you're taking a course or watching an interview or reading a book about someone who has nothing to do with your field, there's so much insights about success that you can learn and apply to yourself. It's just a reminder to yourself, be open to learning from as many people as you can and see how you can apply things from different types of people in your passions and your goals.
And this has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow us wherever you listen. Leave us a comment or review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPTpod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie.
I'll leave you with a quote from John Mulaney. I have this quote on a t-shirt. I love this quote. Do my friends hate me, or do I just need to go to sleep? John Mulaney. Love you guys. Thanks for taking the time.